I've been puzzling over a question I heard the Canadian clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson ask a while back. He mentioned that society has become pretty good at identifying when the right goes too far. These lines have been drawn pretty clearly. Racism, racial supremacy, jingoism, and nativism are all examples of the right wing going too far. We're fairly sensitive to these things. In a nutshell, the right goes too far when they start pushing for racial or ethnic purity. But when, Peterson asks, does the left go too far? I've been noodling over this for a while. He appears to have asked because even though there have been numerous documented cases where the left went too far, especially in the 20th century, the line between behavior that is too far and not too far is not so clear as it is for the right. Our society, especially in the press, appears to not be capable of identifying this frontier. Indeed, we see certain acts of violence from left-leaning groups, such as Antifa or Occupy, that many in society and the press appear to make excuses for rather than condemn outright.
It says it right in the name, Antifa, anti-fascism, which is what they were there fighting. Listen, there's, no organization is perfect. There was some violence.
But I think I figured out where the line is. It happens when the left starts murdering Vietnamese Catholics. This occurred to me when I was reading about the period before the Vietnam War where the French were attempting to retake their empire in the wake of World War II. Having driven out the Japanese with the assistance of the United States, the Viet Minh, which would later become the Viet Cong, was resisting the French attempts to retake Indochina. Early on, they spent a fair amount of time killing people who collaborated with the French. Now this, in and of itself, doesn't have to be a bad thing. I mean, I have a hunch that the killings involved no due process and were frequently quite brutal, but killing traitors in a war isn't necessarily wrong. I'm sure if we'd shot Benedict Arnold in the face during the Revolution, it would have been perfectly fine. But then the Viet Minh got a little paranoid. They started going after people who might be collaborators. And they started to think of Catholics, a group of people who'd obtained their religion from the French, as potential collaborators. And then they started doing all manner of terrible things to them. They didn't stop there. They eventually got to the point where they were killing Trotskyites, which is really just another variant of communism. But apparently that wasn't pure enough, and the Viet Minh had to kill anyone who wasn't towing the party line. This sort of purging is all too common in left-leaning revolutions. Obviously, Pol Pot got a little nuts one country over from Vietnam and Cambodia. In the late 70s, communist revolutionaries in Afghanistan imprisoned, tortured, and or killed a variety of religious leaders, politicians, and intellectuals who weren't on board with the new regime. Che Guevara famously executed hundreds at La Habana. Even more minor revolutions, such as in revolutionary Catalonia, had this problem. The progenitors of many of the communist revolutions, the Soviets, had their own purges. Before World War II, the Soviets, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, helped the Germans train their tank corps. But when the Germans turned on the Soviets, both sides became suspicious of the troops that had trained together. The Germans imprisoned, interrogated, and tortured many of the officers that had worked with the Soviets. But Stalin chose the simpler approach. He just wasted anyone who'd had anything to do with the Germans. This was not the only purge by the Soviets, but this one in particular would come back to haunt them. Not only had they helped create the Nazi blitzkrieg, but when it attacked them, many of their best officers were dead by Stalin's orders. This may explain why the Russians got hammered so hard. Early on, many of their units were commanded by inexperienced commanders who the Germans overwhelmed. But it's not just the communist revolutionaries who did this. Long before the existence of communism, the earliest left-leaning revolution of the Revolutionary Age was the French Revolution. They got so carried away that they started sending butlers and housemaids of the aristocracy to the guillotine, just for fear that they might be a problem for the new revolutionary government. If the right goes too far when it starts purging people in the name of ethnic or racial purity, the left goes too far when they purge people in the name of ideological purity. And I can't help but think we're seeing the early indications of this today in the form of cancel culture. Cancel culture is the peculiar tendency to attack, harass, and attempt to end careers of people who stray from the orthodoxy of the new left. We saw this when Yale students protested and harassed Nicholas Christakis. He's a professor who had the nerve to defend his wife Erica's email, which advised students not to get too carried away if they saw offensive costumes on Halloween. Both were subjected to harassment and threats. We also saw this with Brett Weinstein and his wife Heather Heying. Both professors at Evergreen College, they dared to push back against the day of absence. Originally, this was a day where minority students and faculty voluntarily stayed home to highlight their contributions to the college. But in 2017, somebody decided to change it up and declare that the white students and teachers should stay away on that day. When Weinstein pushed back, he was met with endless protests. Both he and his wife ultimately resigned as well. And of course, there's the aforementioned Jordan Peterson. He got blowback when he criticized a Canadian bill involving preferred gender pronouns. He claimed that this violated civil rights by compelling speech. He didn't get fired, but he did get, and still does get, an endless cacophony of online hate. These are examples of the new left attempting to eliminate ideas that don't conform to their ideological dogma. It is assumed that their beliefs on race, cultural appropriation, and gender pronouns are incontestable. Opposing views, or even nuanced views, are not tolerated. Anyone who dares step out of line is crushed, even people who are more closely aligned with them than with the right, such as all of the professors I just mentioned who identify as left-leaning. The new left isn't quite so violent as the alt-right, yet, but that doesn't mean they can't become that way. It certainly wouldn't be the first time. And I can't help but see a parallel between their paranoia and the paranoia of the Viet Minh when they began killing Vietnamese Catholics. So this is the line where the left goes too far, the line that the press always seems to miss. They go too far when they become so paranoid that they'd rather silence people with differing opinions, or even people who they suspect of nonconformance, rather than engage with them in a mature and intelligent way. And if we let this happen, we run the risk of weakening ourselves the way Stalin weakened the Soviet armies.